My name is Janet Payne. I was born and raised in Stafford County. Well, both of my parents were born in Stafford County, and my story is about Dick and Clara. They were my parents. My father always asked to be called by the name Dick. His real name was Richard Lee Payne, and he was born in a small farm up on 17 at Payne's Corner. And that was named after my grandparents. They had a small farm there, and the beautiful American Gothic home still exists on the site. And designated as Payne's Corner, it's right where Poplar Road and 17 intersect. And in my father's family, he had 3 younger sisters, and they were Mildred, Frances, and Marietta. And at an early age, my father, it was very clear that he took on the responsibilities of doing things. He fixed things, he volunteered for things, and he loved Stafford County. His parents were both ill, and so he had to step in and be the big brother to his 3 younger sisters, maintain the farm, and he carried mail. And because of his responsibility, he was never drafted or gone into the military whatsoever, even though he would have loved to have done that. But what was at his heart was service to Stafford County, service to his community, to his church, and to his family. He always took care of everyone, whether it was a neighbor. He knew no stranger. Anyway, his father worked at a Buick dealership in Fredericksburg in addition to farming, and it was a very interesting time. He went to school in Stafford, of course, and then later, when he got older, he married my mother, Clara, and Clara was from Hartwood, the Huffman home in Hartwood. And there, when she went to school, she loved school. She discovered that she was quite a student and had a great passion for education. At a very early age, she was about 12 or 13, her teacher took her home one afternoon and told her parents that she had taught Clara everything she knew, and that it was really important for her to go to Fredericksburg so she could get a proper education, a high school education, with the idea of going to college. So my grandfather put my mother in the wagon and took her to Fredericksburg, where she boarded. She loved school, and she never returned to the farm. She stayed in Fredericksburg and went to Fredericksburg High School, and then she went to the State Normal School for Women, which later became Mary Washington College. Her first teaching job was at Berea School, and it just so happened that she was able to board at the Payne home, which that's where she met my father. And so she taught so many of the people at Berea. It was very interesting that after my parents were married, Dick and Clara were married, they attended Berea Baptist Church. And I can remember as a small child having people just stop in the aisles and tell me stories about being a student of my mother's. Great characters around Berea, Stacy Raines, Richard Beckham, people that, very familiar, and they loved Miss Clara. She was Miss Clara it was never Clara, it was always Miss Clara. But everyone loved her and loved the church. My parents were quite active and involved in the church. My mother taught Sunday school and worked with the Women's Missionary Union. And my father he loved to take care of the church. He and his best friend, James Blake, they were very much involved in helping to design the church additions and to see particularly that the electrical work, that everything was done properly. They even came up with the idea of indirect lighting in the sanctuary, which was quite beautiful because the sanctuary at Berea is historic and a beautiful example of architecture. But my father was always involved. He was always working on a project at Berea. My parents went to live on Route 17, about 1.5 miles out of Falmouth. And this was very important because my father was working at the Sylvania plant. He was an electrician, and he was in the engineering department. And my mother taught at Gary Melcher's with an incredible group of women teachers. They were incredibly powerful, bright women, and my mother was one of those who was really a wonderful teacher. You know, everyone in the community rallied around the school and worked with the school. We didn't have a lot, but my fondest memories are going with my mother when she would get her class roll, which would usually be about the end of June. And my mother had this idea that she needed to go into every home of every student that she was going to have in September. So my mother would put me in the car and we would ride around Stafford County. She would make sure she had called and introduced herself. And I got to see so many homes in Stafford and meet so many people because we would go in and sit in the living room and talk with the mother. Sometimes the father would be there, and my mother would have that opportunity to meet the son or the daughter that she would be having in class in the fall. So it was a wonderful time because I learned so much about Stafford County by going into all these houses. And to this day, wherever I am in the county, I can always find one or two of the homes that are still in place. And this way my mother created these bonds between parents and children before they came in the fall. And so that was an incredible story, just to spend my summers traveling around Stafford and meeting people. And after we finished our tour, we would go down to the King George Stafford School Board office. And at that time, King George and Stafford shared the division. My report card in the elementary years said King George Stafford Public Schools. And there was a wonderful woman down there, Eleanor Carrington, and she took care of the books. She took care of everything. She was a fabulous woman. And my mother would take me in, and we'd go into this large room where books would be stacked to the ceiling. And we would count out the books, how many math books, how many social studies books, how many English books. We'd stack them up in the car. And at that time, the books had to be purchased by the students or rented. That was an option. So we would get her set up, go back to the school, take all the books out of the car and stack them up so that she'd be ready to start in the fall. My father, working at the Sylvania plant, which became finally FMC, was the last owner of that at the site. But my father was so involved in the community. He loved his job, he loved his family, and he loved his community. He was one of the first members of the Falmouth Volunteer Fire Department. He loved being around the firehouse, talking with the men. He took great pride in keeping all of the equipment as shiny as possible. And one of my great summer memories was that of going to fireman parades. And my father would come home from work, he'd go straight in and get ready, and he'd put on his uniform and he'd go down by the road at 17 and wait for the fire truck to come by and pick him up to go to the parade. So each summer I had the opportunity to pick out which fireman parades I would like to go to. So Warrenton, Orange, and Colonial Beach were my favorites. And my mother would drive me down to the parade, and we'd see my father go by. And these were incredible parades in the fact that everyone in every community that wanted to participate would bring their pride in the fire truck garage. And they would always wait. It seemed like when children were gathered and they would sound the siren and everybody would scream and hold their ears. But it was a wonderful memory. And we would then go to where they'd have rides set up, concession stands set up, and you just had a wonderful time. And then my father would drive home, and the remaining men would drive the truck back to Falmouth. But that was one of my vivid and wonderful memories of childhood, and certainly one that was a great source of pride for my father. He always dreamed that when he retired that he would join the Fredericksburg Rescue Squad, because he took all of these classes in first aid, and he was such a community servant that he thought that was just be what he wanted to spend his retirement in. but he loved that fire department. And another area that he was very much involved in was the Masonic Lodge. And I can remember those evenings when my father would come home from the plant, and he would put on his best suit and his bow tie, and he would carry his fez out and get in the car, and he'd drive to Fredericksburg for his lodge meetings. And in addition to that, he worked with the Grotto, and they had a concession stand at the Fredericksburg Agricultural Fair. And in the afternoons when he left the plant, he would walk over and work in the concession stand. It was, my father actually was one of the people that helped build this cinder block structure. And it's interesting because when I go to the fair now, I still see that same building that my father helped build. And I remember they just took great pride in their hamburgers. It was something about their hamburgers. Anyone that went into the fair wanted to get one of those hamburgers. But it was another contribution that my father made to the community. He was also one of the people that helped start the Stafford Sportsman's Club, which was really a precursor to the Boosters. And of course, that was about fundraising as well. And so each year they would have a giant fundraiser it was a talent show. And they had an event called the Queen of Sports. And young ladies could sign up and they would collect money, and whoever collected the most money would be crowned Queen of Sports. The talent show was always very good, very interesting to see another side of students that you didn't know existed. But another part of that fundraiser was a bake sale, and they would raffle off sweets. And each year it was my mother's contribution to make her famous pound cake. And so my mother received $5 for her pound cake. And my father went home and thought that was quite an accomplishment, that they'd never sold a cake for $5 before. So that was one of the highlights of that event for my mother.